I used to live a hectic life, constantly traveling from one place to another, using plane rides between destinations to catch up on email or to design a presentation, to read background documents shared by clients to help me have an industry or organization-specific context. Regardless of how much I prepared, I always felt exhausted and a bit unprepared going into yet another meeting with a new client or related to a new project or in a new time zone. During this hectic period of my life, which by the way lasted decades, I had an experience that sticks with me to this day. It wasn't a long or even terrible exchange, but it certainly created a learning moment for me. I'd arrived late night on Tuesday with a client meeting scheduled the entire following day. We were facilitating a strategic planning process for a prestigious university, and the first meeting of the day began at 8:30 a.m., was with the committee. It was my first time meeting the group in person and my first opportunity to make that incredibly important impression. I have to also mention that one of the important reasons we were engaged to lead the strategic planning process is because of our stellar reputation, bringing equity, diversity, and inclusion into everything that we do. We assured our client that we would reflect and help them model inclusive practices in every step of their strategic planning process. Another sidebar, my son was quite young at the time, and though an 8:30 a.m. meeting is not unheard of, much of my morning was spent talking to my son and explaining why he had to go to school, where I was at, when I would be home, and counting together on the calendar the number of days until we saw each other again. My head was all over the place. And then I walked into the meeting room. The dean, who I thought was kicking off the meeting and facilitating the introductions of the committee members, didn't. She immediately called the meeting to order and handed off to me. I was startled. I was not prepared, thinking that I would use the first few minutes and introductions to get myself focused and then really fully present. When my expectation didn't happen, I fumbled. I looked around the table trying to figure out how to get started, and I clumsily said, "Good morning, ladies. It's exciting to be sitting at a table full of women and know that we get to do this important work together," just kind of off top of my head. Within 0.5 seconds, one of the people at the far end of the table replied, "My pronouns are they, them. I would like to ask that we not assume that we are all binary." So much for my first impression. I'm describing myself as being tired, not fully focused, and full of good intentions. As real as all of those experiences are for me in that particular situation, my focus on them is described as centering myself. I'm centering my needs, my feelings, my experience. A more inclusive alternative is to, as I reflect on the experience, pause. What will immediately come to mind is myself, but then I need to intentionally seek to understand from the other person's perspective. In fact, all of the other people's perspective in the room. I realize that I can't. None of us can always be perfectly composed and always show up exactly how we want, but we can certainly bring more intentionality, and consistently so. As much as I'd love to give you a checklist of words to use, words to avoid, and to assure you that we will never offend anyone, I absolutely cannot do that. Language is too complicated for that. It keeps changing. And even when there seems to be norms about certain preferred words or language, I can't assure you that those will apply to every single person. I identify as biracial. I was born in the United States. I'm black and white. I'm straight. I'm cisgender. I'm a woman. I'm a mother, and a whole bunch of other things. I intentionally chose to use the words black instead of African American because black, to me, has broader access and it can include people who are not born in the United States. However, there are plenty of black folks born in the US who prefer to use African American. I describe myself as a US citizen, not an American, because American can, in my opinion, be applied to other Americans beyond the US, like Canada, which shares North America with the US, and South America, for example. Again, if you ask others, they might have quite different preferences. So the trick about inclusive language is to be willing to embrace both and more. Both means your own preferences and that of another person. And means that there are likely even more preferences held by other people. And more means that this language thing is likely going to continue to evolve. Here's what I mean. When talking about inclusive communication, people regularly ask me about how Plural pronouns work in languages like Spanish that are heavily anchored to gender identification for many words. How do we move beyond binary if the language actually calls for gender identification? That question, that's the more I want us to hold on to. As for the exact right answer, I don't have it. What I can tell you is that language changes, context changes. Personal preferences about language is absolutely personal to the individual. The language we use is rooted in our personal experiences and biases. The words we consciously and unconsciously select for our communication carry meaning, whether that is in a formal presentation or through a routine email. These meanings are received and interpreted by individuals and groups based on a variety of factors such as tone, pace, context, culture, all sorts of things. However, our ability to adapt our communication to account for more diverse audiences can be accomplished through simple substitutions of terms and phrases, or by reframing the communication from multiple perspectives. As a leader, as a manager, as an influencer, be aware of the impact of your words and how they may be received, even by people who know you, who you believe understand your intentions and goodwill, and even by people with whom you believe share a cultural identity. Make sure that you routinely checking your communication for bias, exclusion, or centering of dominant group experiences. Consider these questions the next time you draft a memo, you introduce a talk, you make a phone call, or you open a discussion with a colleague. Am I making assumptions about gender or the pronouns that someone uses? How do I define personal relationships? Who do I consider family? Who is a friend? Am I considering the audience's mobility and accessibility? Am I assuming that the message recipients share my preferred language? How do I know when I'm being insensitive to another culture, identity, or life choice? Am I assuming that my perspective is the default perspective? Again, there's no official right answer, not now and not for an entire group of people. Inclusive communication is going to require your ongoing intentional practice and solicitation, acceptance, and incorporation of feedback. By the way, that's exactly what I did in the meeting I mentioned earlier. I immediately apologized. I thanked the person for their feedback, and I made a commitment out loud to use the preferred language and to practice more inclusive skills going forward. We're all learning, and in this space, we will often find grace.